This is the last message in this series on Book of Acts. We have seen Paul going on 3 journeys, and finally he is going to Rome. So this is on his way to Rome. I have a map here. They boarded the ship at Adramyttium. He was in Caesarea, so there they boarded the ship, and then they went to Sidon, to Myra and Cnidus, Salmone in Crete, to Fair Havens, and then there was a shipwreck, and then from there to Malta, and there from there they went to Syracuse, and then Rhegium, Puteoli. Finally, they went to Rome. This journey from Caesarea to Rome, it's a hard journey. From Caesarea to Rome, it's a hard journey. It was not a smooth ride. Going hungry for days and months, harsh winter, storm, no sunlight, just water around them. There's no land. They were in a ship, just going in that. It looks very small area for us on this map, but it's huge. So in the middle of that Mediterranean Sea, they were going nowhere because in the olden days they were dependent on the wind to move them into certain direction. So it was a very hard travel for Paul. But even in that situation, we see the true leadership of Paul. If you look at the leaders in the Bible, in the Old Testament, we regard Moses as one of the greatest leaders. When it comes to New Testament, of course, Jesus is the master leader. And after that, we see Paul, one of the greatest leaders in the New Testament. And we see true leadership of Paul coming up in the difficult situation. A lot of times, when everything is fine, when everybody is cooperating and everything is going smooth, it is very easy for a leader to lead. But it is really hard for a leader when everything is going wrong, when people are not cooperating, or when things going wrong, when you are in a very difficult situation. That's when the real true leadership comes up. We see here Paul as one of the greatest leaders in the New Testament, and he was going through very tough time. This was the travel that we don't see in any other places, with so many difficulties and such a cruel weather, and in the winter, not even seeing sunlight. Such hard travel he had to go through. Paul was just a prisoner. He was not a leader there. He was the prisoner. He was under a commander, a centurion. His name is Julius. Now you know where the name Julius comes from. It's from here. We had Julius the speaker, right? So, Julius gave permission to Paul to go and be with his friends. If you look at chapter 27, verse 2, it says, we bounded for ship. Then chapter 27, verse 3. The next day we landed at Sidon. And Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so that they might provide him for his needs. So he allowed him. Paul was a prisoner, and here the centurion was giving him a free ride. Basically, let him go freely to meet his friends. If he loses the prisoner, what happens? He has to pay back with his life. it is a serious thing to just lose a prisoner. Here, this man trusted Paul enough to give him the freedom to move around, to meet with other people. So, what we see here is a leader is someone who is trusted. And, Paul was he always has others' interest first. That's why he was able to write, you have to esteem others better than yourself. You have to put others before yourself. And here, probably this man Julius observed Paul, and he took note of the things that he was always putting others first. He was no threat to Roman government at all, and he trusted him. And also, a leader is someone who does not work for his personal gain. A leader is one who always puts others first and others' interests first. Now, they boarded this ship, and then they moved on to different places. And if you look at chapter 27, verse 9, it says, much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous, because by now it was after the fast. So Paul warned them. So it was, between mid-September to early November, it was a very dangerous period for the ships to move around. So here, there was this Day of Atonement coming up. Day of Atonement comes in early October. So they were traveling early October. It was winter there, and October, November are harsh winter days, and they cannot really go on the sea journey during that time. So Paul told them, he warned them, let's take a break here. Let's stay here for the winter, and after winter is done, we can move on. It was in chapter 27, verse 10. Paul warned them, saying, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo and to our own lives also. But what happened here? The centurion did not listen to Paul, and he listened to the advice of the pilot and the owner of the ship. And also later we see that he listened to the majority of the people, and then they moved on from there, hoping that they will reach Phoenix in winter. Not Phoenix, Arizona, but there was a Phoenix in that map. So they were hoping to move on from that place and move towards Phoenix. But, they did not heed Paul's warning. The leader always uses good judgment. And if you see later, whatever Paul said was true. They were in a dangerous, disastrous situation. The ship was broken. Paul is a leader who takes initiative. He told them that this is going to happen, and this is the leader who used good judgment. And verse 12, if we see, that's where we see that majority decided to move on. Sometimes majority's decision might not always be right. It might not be right sometimes, because majority will think about their comfort and just move on. But a man of God will think about what God wants him to do. So that's why here we see that Paul was basing his judgment on God's revelation and the leading from God, but they did not listen to him. So verses 13 to 20, we see the storm. The storm becomes very dangerous here. They tried a lot of things, and the hurricane's name is Northeaster. And the ship was caught in the storm, and they tried to lower the lifeboats, and they tried to do a lot of things, throw away the stuff from the ship to lighten the ship. But after doing all that, they just let the ship wander in the sea, and they lost hope. If you look at verse 20, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. So they gave up all hope. See, that is the time Paul stood up before them, and he said, "Men, you should have taken my advice, then you would have spared this damage." And then he goes on to say, "But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost." A leader is one who takes the initiation in the time of crisis, in the time of difficulties and hard situation. We see here Paul, taking in charge, because till now Paul was not the leader, and they were obeying the owner of the ship, commander, and all of them. But here, when they lost all hope, Paul became the leader, and he took the initiative, and he encouraged them. He was not condemning them for not listening to him, but still he says, "Last night an angel of the Lord, whom I am, angel of God, whose I am and whom I serve, stood beside me and said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar.'" See, his judgment or his advice to them is based on God's revelation. God showed him that he will stand trial before the Caesar. So here we see that this leader, he takes initiative in the time of crisis, and he is the leader who speaks with authority, and he has the revelation from God, and probably he might also have witnessed to them, saying, "This is my God." And he did these kind of wonderful things in the past. And here he was encouraging them. And he strengthened others. And leader is one who is optimistic, enthusiastic, and he believes in the victory. He said, "None of you will be lost." How could he say that? The situation is so worse that the ship is going here and there, and there's so much of turmoil, the storm and cold winter. But he assures them, "None of you will be lost," because that's what is his faith. He believes in victory. He believes that God will fulfill his promise no matter what. Now, we cannot be a leader, an effective leader, if we are pessimistic. Some time ago I shared this. An optimist looks at opportunity in every problem, whereas a pessimist looks at problem in every opportunity. Here Paul was in a problematic situation. It's a hopeless situation, that he was optimistic. He was enthusiastic. He believes in victory. He believes in God. He has that faith that God will fulfill his promise no matter what. That's what is a leader. When you are in a storm, you cannot really depend on human wisdom. Here it's a literally storm, but in our lives there will be storms. And those storms, sometimes they shake our faith. They shake our beliefs in a real God. A lot of times we may not feel God's presence when we go through these storms. It could be a storm in your relationships. It could be a storm in your workplace. It could be a storm in something. that is unexpectedly happening, or it could be a storm with your health or whatever it may be. When a storm comes, we will be shaken. But if we are anchored in God, we will be firm. Even if a ship is anchored, even if the ship moves on the surface, but it won't go anywhere. So, if you take that analogy, in our lives there will be storms, and if we have to stay still, stay firm, we have to be anchored. Bible says we have to be anchored in Jesus Christ. So here Paul was very sure that none of them will be lost, and they will reach the destination. And also, moving on, chapter 27, 33 to 38, there was another situation. Paul encourages them again. 33, it says, just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. For the last 14 days, he said, you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. After he said this, he took some bread, gave thanks to God in front of them all. He broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. See, these are not 10 people or 20 people, 276 people. Actually, Luke also was traveling with them. That's why we read, we traveled in many places in this chapter. So, Paul was a prisoner, but Luke was accompanying him. And here, 276 people, they were on this ship. This ship was taking grain to Rome. So, they were caught in this storm. They did not eat anything for 14 days. And it says there was no sun, no moon. So it was pitch dark. It's just probably it's foggy in the daytime and dark in the night time, just in the open sea, nothing they could see. It was a terrible time. And that is the time the leader's skill is tested, or leader's leadership is tested. And here we see that leader does not compromise the absolutes. And he focuses on the objective and he leads by example. He told them, we have to eat to survive. And he led by example. He took the bread, broke it, and he ate. And it says, whenever we read this kind of passage, like he took some bread, gave thanks to God, he broke it and began to eat, immediately we remember the communion. When the night before Jesus was betrayed, he took the bread, broke it, gave thanks, and gave it to them, right? But this particular situation is not about communion. It's just basically bread is what they eat. So Paul gave thanks and then took the bread and he ate and he gave to them. So it's just normal meal. But what we see here is Paul is setting an example. He is so optimistic in such a horrible situation or a hopeless situation. But still, he was leading them by example. And 42 to 44, these soldiers, they wanted to kill everybody so that they can escape. But then centurion, he wanted to spare Paul's life. Actually, because of Paul, all of them were spared. And we see in 42, the soldiers planned to kill the prisoners, to prevent any of them from swimming away. And then 43, but the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life, kept him from carrying out their plan. Verse 44, the rest were to get there on plan. So he ordered them to jump and swim to the shore, because they saw something coming, some island coming up. So they all jumped, they went to the shore, and they reached this place called Malta. Actually, Paul describes his sufferings in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 24 to 27. This is not the only time Paul endured the shipwreck. Let's read 2 Corinthians chapter 11, 24 to 27. It says, 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. 3 times he was shipwrecked. I spent a night and day in open sea. I have been constantly on the move. I have been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my own countrymen, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, in danger from false brothers. I have labored and toiled and have gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst and have often gone without food. I have been cold and naked. See, reading these sufferings of Paul, and if we look at our own lives, how comfortable we are. Paul was the greatest writer in the New Testament, and because he was trained through all these kind of experiences, all these hard situations, all these hard experiences. 3 times whipped, like 39 times each time, 3 times like that, and taking those beatings for the thing that he did not do, and beaten with rods, and being shipwrecked 3 times, being on the sea whole day and night, going through this kind of hard life. I would not imagine myself going through that kind of life. Paul, God chose Paul for that purpose, and God knew that Paul can endure that kind of suffering, and Paul was able to endure that kind of suffering because he knew whom he knew. He knew who his God was. He knew he had that kind of relationship, that kind of intimate, close relationship with Jesus. That's why he was able to go through these sufferings. And they ended up in Malta. That's also called Melita. It's an island of 17 miles long and 9 miles wide, 60 miles from Sicily. So if you see in chapter 28, it starts off saying that this is the island they arrived at, and those islanders, they were very kind to them. They showed the hospitality. Let's read chapter 28. Once safely on shore, we found out that the island was called Malta. The islanders showed us unusual kindness. They built a fire and welcomed us. So these islanders, they were really practicing hospitality. They were not Christians. They were not Jews. And they were just living out this kindness. Sometimes non-Christians will be kind to us, sometimes more than the Christians. Here we see that their hospitality. Bible says that we should practice hospitality. Abraham practiced hospitality. That's why he was able to meet with the angels. And Bible admonishes us, saying that in the past, people met strangers and they even met angels by practicing this hospitality. I think we should grow in this area of hospitality. And here we see these people, even though they were not Christians or they were not Jews, they don't know the law and all that, but they were practicing kindness in their lives. And here, Paul was working along with them. He picked up sticks. See, this is another leadership quality. He did not dictate them. He also was doing what he expects others to do. He went and he picked up the sticks and they made a fire. Remember, these are 276 people. Must be a huge fire they put there. And it was cold and rainy and windy. And there was a serpent that was sticking to his hand. It fastened itself on his hand. When the islanders saw the snake was hanging from his hand, they said, "This must be a murderer." And he escaped from the sea, but justice has not allowed him to live. See, they were worshipping a goddess called Justice. In Greek, it is Dike. Dike is in Greek mythology. She is the daughter of Zeus, and they were worshipping that goddess Justice, and they thought that goddess Justice did not allow him to live, and he will die. But then Paul shook the snake off into the fire and suffered no ill effects. Some people think that this viper did not actually bite him. It was only hanging to his hand, and he just shook his hand. But if it was just hanging to his hand, it has not bitten him, these people would not have expected him to die, because they are very much familiar with the vipers, the poisonous snakes in that area, and they knew that the moment this viper bites him, he will die. But it's a miracle that God has done that Paul did not die, because God has a purpose for Paul to reach Rome and stand before the Caesar. Now here we see that these people, once they realized that he was not dead, they called him God. The lot of it is very similar to Indian context. Like if somebody does a miracle, we call him like a god. If somebody if something like this happens, like if a viper bites and the person does not die, we think there is some power in that person. But we know it is God who was doing this miracle. And later he moves on to this man, Publius. He is the chief official of that island. It is called the first man. His title is first man. That means he is like a president in that island, and he has a big estate. He took care of these 276 people for 3 days, fed them, provided to them. Paul was there for 3 months. And looking at this, the miracle that has happened, it's a prophecy fulfillment. If you look at Luke chapter 10, verse 19, Luke 10:19, it says, "I have given you authority to trample on snakes and scorpions and to overcome all the power of the enemy. Nothing will harm you." This is Jesus telling the disciples. Mark 16:18. Mark 16:18. It says, "They will pick up snakes with their hands, and when they drink deadly poison, it will not hurt them at all. They will place their hands on sick people and they will get well." here, Paul was bitten by the viper. It did not harm him. And he went to this man Publius' home, and his father was suffering from fever and dysentery. And Paul prayed, and he laid his hands, and he healed him. So we see the miracles, one after the other, happening here. Actually, those verses that I read about snakes and poison, some people literally take that and say even today it will happen. And I saw one of these shows where it's a worship service. These people, they are taking the snakes and throwing to each other and worshipping, saying that, okay, even if snakes bite us, nothing will happen. But that's taking the things out of context. You should never test God. That's why when Satan came to tempt Jesus, Satan said, if you jump from here, angels will hold you. That is true. Angels will hold. Actually, in the Psalms we read that. There's a prophecy. But Jesus should not test God the Father by jumping. In other words, if he does that, he was obeying the Satan. So, even making the stones to bread, he could do that. If you are a son of God, can you do this? So he can do that. But he does not do it because he does not obey the Satan. And he says, we should not test the Lord our God. So, here, Paul experienced these miracles, and God will do the miracles when it is needed. So we cannot expect today take a poison and still live, because it's a common sense, But if somebody poisoned you, for your faith, like it happened to Sadhu Sundar Singh, so they poisoned him. His own mother poisoned him, and he survived. God does miracles, but we cannot test God by saying, okay, because it is written like this, I will take poison and I'll see what happens. Here, prophecy was fulfilled in Paul's case here, and he stayed there 3 months in Malta, and probably he must have preached the whole gospel to that whole island. Probably there might have been a church formed in that island. How do we know? Because if you look at the end of his journey from there, if you look at verse 11, after 3 months, we put out to the sea in a ship that has wintered in the island. So before that, verse 10, they honored us in many ways when we were ready to sail. They furnished us with the supplies we needed. So 3 months they were there, 276 people, and they furnished everything that they needed. And also all the sick people on that island, they were all healed because of Paul. So, wherever Paul went, there was his influence. And God did miracles, and God used him to form the churches. And from there, finally, they reached to Puteoli, which is Pozzuoli today. Today, this is a modern day city, Pozzuoli. It's a port city, and they import grain from that place. It's a grain importing center for entire Rome in the Bay of Neapolis. And Paul met other believers there. And when he saw them, he was really encouraged. Look at verse 15. It says, the brothers there had heard that we were coming, and they traveled as far as Forum of Appius and the 3 taverns and to meet us. At the sight of these men, Paul thanked God and was encouraged. Probably Paul was so discouraged in this travel, but when he saw these believers travel like 30-40 miles to see him, he was so much encouraged. Gospel already reached Rome by the time Paul went there. Paul did not preach there and form a church, but gospel already reached there. Probably because at Pentecost time there were Romans living in Jerusalem. Probably they took gospel to Rome, and there were other people who scattered during the persecution. They went and shared the good news. There was a church already there, and here Paul was really encouraged to see them, to come and hearing him. And verse 16 it says, when we entered Rome. They finally entered Rome. Not the way Paul wanted or not the way Paul expected. He expected to go into Rome, maybe as a prisoner, to go and then be before Caesar in a smooth way, like a smooth transition from Caesarea to Rome. But this probably more than 6 months, in this travel, going from here and there, in all these places with harsh winter and storm, he might not have expected. But God has a plan. God has a plan to reach to all those 276 soldiers. Probably all of them would have been saved. God has a plan to reach this small island, Malta. Probably they were cut off from the mainland and maybe no connections. And how will they hear gospel? Because of that, God sent Paul there. So God has his own plans. Even when we go through tough times and difficulties and sickness, whatever, God has his own plans. So we have to recognize that, rather than thinking, why God, why all these things, why all these difficulties, why, these kind of sufferings, rather than thinking that we have to think God has a purpose and what God wants us to do in that situation. Paul did not complain. We don't see Paul saying any time here, God, why did you allow me to go through this tough situation? He might have prayed a lot. He might have got discouraged a little bit, but he was an optimist. And he never questioned God, because he knew that God's promise will be fulfilled ultimately, whatever he goes through. When a man of God is faithful to God's will, God will fulfill his dream. His dream is to go to Rome, ultimately, to stand before the Caesar, to tell all the kings and all these soldiers and the commanders and centurions the gospel. His dream is being fulfilled. If you look from God's perspective, even though Paul went through this hard situation, God always surrounded Paul with kindness. He fulfills his dream, and God ministered to his needs. If you look at verse 7 and 28, Publius, he took care of Paul. And verse 10 and verse 14, we read all these verses where they were so kind to him. Even on the island of Malta, they provided all the things that he needed. God himself encouraged him, 27-23, through an angel. Angel appeared to him in his dream, and he encouraged. There were other people who were encouraging Paul. Here in Rome, they traveled all the way to meet Paul, and Paul was encouraged. God protected him at the sea, in the storm, and from the snake. You see, God's hand is there, but we don't see that. Here we only see Paul going through this hard, difficult situation, all kinds of problems in a hopeless situation. But God was there, taking care of him in every step. No doubt, it was a hard situation. It was very hard for Paul, but still, we see God's kindness, God ministering to his needs, God providing to him, God being with him at the sea and in the storm, even when the snake has bitten him. And God also blessed his influence. all these 276 soldiers heard the gospel. People at Malta, Syracuse, everywhere he went, everywhere this ship has stopped, probably he might have preached there. And finally, he had the effect on Rome. We see him writing that the letter to Romans. They say that's the greatest letter in the New Testament, because Christian theology, the doctrine, is there in that book. And we see that his influence in the Roman church. And finally, God fulfilled his desire of getting to Rome. So we have to recognize God's hand, even though Paul was going through the tough situation. Now, towards the end, we see that Paul talks to the Jewish leaders. He explained them. He was not against them, and there was another meeting arranged. Large number of people came. Finally, he was able to give gospel from morning till night. It says Paul explained about the kingdom of God morning till night. Of course, there was rejection. But then he quotes this prophecy from Isaiah chapter 6, 9 to 10. The same verse here he quotes that God gives this prophecy to prophet Isaiah. Go to these people and say, you will be ever hearing but never understanding. You will be ever seeing but never perceiving. For this people's heart has become calloused, and they hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed eyes. They have closed their eyes. Otherwise, they might see and with their eyes, and hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn, and I would heal them. So he was saying, this is the prophecy that is being fulfilled. Because you are only hearing, but you are closing your eyes. You're closing your ears, but you are seeing, but you are closing your eyes. And you are not perceiving. So, the rejection of gospel we see here. Even today, people, they hear, but they close their ears. They see, but they don't perceive. They don't come to Christ because of their hard-heartedness. Even for believers, sometimes when God speaks to you, speaks to me, if I close my ears, if I close my eyes, I don't understand what God is telling me, or I don't take it. That's why Jesus says, he who has an ear, let him hear. Everybody has ears. But what he means by that is, he who wants to hear, let him hear. He who is attentive to God's word, let him hear. Here, these people, they came from morning till night. They were listening to Paul, but their ears are closed, their eyes were closed, and their hearts were calloused. Means they have hard-heartedness. We have to examine when we hear God's word, how is our heart? Is it a hard-hearted heart or soft heart? For 2 years, Paul stayed there in his own rented home, and he taught about Jesus Christ with all boldness, without any hindrance. And his case was dismissed, because we don't see Paul's death here at the end of this chapter. So probably after 2 years, his case was dismissed. But later, the history tells us, later he was arrested. In the time of Nero, there was a great fire, and Nero blamed Christians for that fire. And during that time, they caught hold of Paul, and they beheaded Paul. Basically, he gave up his life for Christ. Amazing experiences, amazing life story. It's all because he had that faith. He obeyed God no matter what. That's a commitment he made with God, and he followed that commitment. Now, how do we apply this to our lives? How is our journey in this world? Are we facing difficult, sad, and hopeless situations? If so, do we respond like Paul, or do we get discouraged and depressed and go back in our faith? Our faith will be shaken at times because of certain situations in our life. But how will we be encouraged? By prayer, the God's promises, visions, and dreams through His Word, God will speak. Just like how God encouraged Paul. How are you encouraging others who are going through hopeless situation in their lives? What can we learn from Paul's example? Great leader. In the time of crisis, he took initiative. He instilled hope in them when the situation was hopeless. And he took initiative, he followed, he did what he wanted them to do. We see his humility, picking up sticks. And, he was holding on to God's promise. Finally, he knows that finally he will reach Rome somehow. Are you holding on to God's promise? If God has given you a promise, if things are contrary to that promise, do we lose hope in God's promise, or do we hold on to God's promise? Do we see God's hand in this difficult situation of your life? We see how God took care of Paul. It was not comfortable, but at every situation, God was providing to him, protecting him, taking care of him, encouraging him. That's what God does with us. It might not be easy and smooth life for us, but God will always make sure He will protect us, He will provide to us, He will be with us. So we have to hold on to His promise, and we have to move through this journey saying that God is in charge and He will fulfill His promise all the time. Let's pray. Close.